Thanks to all of you for sitting patiently through the presentations and thinking of all of the great questions that you want to ask at the end of our panel. So I'll ask you to keep those in mind. I'd like to give brief introductions to our panelists. So Nathan, you've already met. Nathan's a professor of economics at Harvard and co-director of the Equality of Opportunity Project. You have a sense of what his research is on because you just saw some of it. Next to Nathan is Jeff Kling. Jeff is the Associate Director for Economic Analysis at the Congressional Budget Office. He's written extensively on public housing and high-poverty neighborhoods. On the other side of Jeff is Pat Sharkey. Pat's a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University. He studies crime and urban neighborhoods. And on the far end is Stephanie DeLuca. Stephanie is the James Coleman Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at Johns Hopkins University, just up the road from us in Baltimore. Her research focuses on how social context affects the outcomes of disadvantaged young people, and she is one of Nathan's co-authors on the paper that was just presented. Thank you guys for being here today. All right, so I think we're going to dive in first to the CMTO project. So I'm going to talk about CMTO as being the Seattle work, and I'll talk about MTO as being the more general project that Jeff and Jens had worked on. So the CMTO project is a really nice way of starting to understand some of the barriers that low-income families face in moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods, low poverty neighborhoods. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I wanted to ask Stephanie in particular, because you've done some qualitative interviews with the families who moved. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the families were telling you about their perception of the barriers? So if you learned anything about why they hadn't moved to high opportunity neighborhoods before, or what they saw as the hurdles to moving to these places.
Sure. So press the button. Is it on now? Turn screen. Okay, great.
Yeah, and do all of you hold it right up to you.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. So thanks for the question, Jenny, because I think one of the things that's exciting, in being up here and sharing this with you is a chance to take the stories of the nearly 120 families that we've talked to in Seattle and bring them here from their homes and McDonald's and Starbucks and libraries, and be able to share them widely. And so I'm grateful for them to, for having shared time with us as we were able to better understand this intervention from their perspective. So I think there are a lot of different ways to come at this. The first thing that I'll say that I think is important and has driven a lot of the mixed methods work I've done on experiments and quasi-experimental interventions is to remember that even if families move, a lot of the challenges that they face also move with them. What that means is they've just, had years of experiences, traumatic, challenging experiences, that really shape the way that they make decisions. And so I think, the question of why, they hadn't made decisions to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods is, maybe better thought of as, how, they've spent so much time trying to juggle whatever they can while they have it, right? We think about this as sort of a bandwidth tax. And so I think what I heard when we sat down to talk to families, when we say first, tell us the story of your life. And that's how we start. And that could take 30 minutes or it could take 2 hours. And then we get to the other stuff. But I think, the first thing is, we met families who, nearly a third of the caregivers we spoke to had been victims of domestic violence. Nearly a third had had significant health problems themselves or, among their children. A quarter were homeless in some way, broadly defined, in those 6 months before we met them. And so I think, these all really shape the kinds of decisions that get made every day. We talked to families from 14 different countries, which was striking. I'm used to living, studying places like Baltimore and Cleveland and Dallas, where there are a lot of families who've always been there. And Washington State is a place that invites families from lots of other places. And so one challenge, I think, too, was just families trying to understand how to navigate institutions and policies locally. This was especially true for the immigrant families, that especially those from East African countries. But I think, in terms of the biggest barriers when we talk to them about their residential history more generally, the biggest barrier we heard about was credit. And it's hard to, I think, overstate the importance of credit and the effect it has on how families perceive themselves as potential clients and tenants that would go to a landlord and say, I'd like to rent one of your places. And, you know, we can talk more broadly when we talk about maybe aspects of the intervention that really helped ease the process for families to lease up who had credit history. But I think the process of being repeatedly denied units because of a spotty credit history is really demoralizing, casting somewhat of residential pessimism, I would call it, on the way families view their choices and their decisions. One mom in Seattle said to me, Sandra said, you know, they won't let you rent when you have credit problems, but you can have a criminal background in Seattle. You know, I don't have any crimes, but I still can't find a place. And so I think the credit problems were really big, you know, and the navigators did a lot of work to help smooth that process out, but that was still one thing, I think, and that, you know, stems from a host of other barriers, right, besides housing, I think that we could certainly talk about.
So this point that Stephanie makes, just, it strikes me as a good point to note how important it is to have ethnographers do this research. When you try to digest everything that's come out from Moving to Opportunity with capital M, it's impossible. And the reason is because this kind of intervention into a family's life produces extremely complex results, particularly for disadvantaged groups who have a lot going on. And so this has to be seen in relation to decades of research on similar housing mobility programs, and more importantly, decades of ethnographic research from people like Elijah Anderson, who've done work showing the importance of violence, Mary Patillo showing how proximity to areas of extreme disadvantage affects the life chances of kids, Stephanie's work showing just the constraints at the low end of the private rental market and how moves are made very quickly in reaction to a crisis where the family is trying to find a safe block that will pass an inspection. And that's it. That's the primary concern. So these insights have come from a large body of ethnographic work. And, you know, if we're going to design policy, one of the things that I love about the Seattle project is that they brought in Stephanie, who can start to understand what's actually going on in families' lives. And this has been done in Baltimore. This is now being done in Seattle. Stephanie's worked in Alabama and elsewhere. And this is where we have learned the most. The experiment has been enormously valuable, but to understand what has actually been going on, I, at least personally, have relied on what Stephanie has found, and Kathy Eden and Laura Tack and a lot of other ethnographers who have done this research.
So I think that's a nice segue, actually, to put it back to Jeff. The paper that Jens presented that you worked on is really trying to reconcile some of the differences in the MTO research, so this experimental program, with the observational research. And you guys sort of rule out a couple of the MTO research finds that for adults at least, there aren't significant improvements in labor market outcomes, and some of the observational research has found that families that move to low poverty neighborhoods do better in the labor market, right? So this was one of the puzzles you're trying to resolve. So you sort of rule out some hypotheses and back into this, very economist-like conclusion that the difference is self-selection on unobservables. So when you do observational research and you see that families move to low poverty neighborhoods and they do better, those families are somehow different than the families who didn't move. And MTO essentially gets people to move who wouldn't have moved without the experimental program. So it sounds like some of the things Stephanie's telling us are giving us a hint of what some of the unobservables are. So things like family credit history, or have they had a traumatic experience in their past, or is there some trauma in the recent present that's causing them to move very quickly? So I'm curious, as you're listening to the results that come out of the CMTO, and especially some of this ethnographic research, does that give you any sort of different insights on either the difference between MTO and the observational studies, or a different way that we can think about, this sort of self-selection on unobservables, which is often kind of opaque to non-economists?
So I have a somewhat different take on that issue. I think of it as there are ways in which moving to Nathan's high opportunity areas have effects on some outcomes and not on other ones. And so the work you're referring to is really about adult economic self-sufficiency, earnings in the labor market and such. And there's a lot of other outcomes that are interesting and important, and some of them don't have that same feature. So we think that the individual characteristics of the adults were very important for labor market outcomes. The effect of living in a high opportunity area seems to be pretty big for adult health outcomes, for the kids' earnings, especially when they moved when they were young, and so on. So I think of the story as being a lot about it's important to have an idea of what outcomes you're interested in and understanding those channels. And with respect to the importance of the ethnography that Pat was talking about, I think of it as being more of an iterative process. And so Stephanie alluded to this, where we did some surveys, we did some in-person semi-structured interviews, then we did some more surveys, then we did some more semi-structured in-person interviews, and then we did some more surveys. And so each time we're going along, we're learning more about like we should have more survey questions on health because we learned some things that we didn't know at the beginning, and we should have a much richer module on criminal victimization, because that's a really important thing that wasn't in the congressional authorizing legislation, but is super important to the families. And so it was really that iteration that I felt like was the place where we were learning the most.
So
can I jump in on that, on the adult outcomes? So I think that the interpretation, I'm glad that you mentioned the other outcomes, because I often get lost in favor of a focus on economic self-sufficiency. But when we think about explaining the children's outcomes, we have to look to the parents, because the mental health improvements and maybe some of the health improvements are things that we saw from our qualitative work in Baltimore helped parents parent more effectively. So I think parents are still benefiting in ways, as Jeff mentioned, but those benefits help us explain how children end up benefiting, right? That those mechanisms are key. So I think that, focus tends to get lost as well, because explaining children's, the increase in children's earnings, or, the chances of them going to college, right? We can explain both through the direct neighborhood effects, but we can also explain through the benefits for parents in their kind of a parenting dividend from also being in safer neighborhoods.
So I want to try to unpack a little bit what we mean when we talk about high opportunity neighborhoods. So as you explained, you guys have a very specific definition, in large part because of how you're able to identify them. Neighborhoods that 30 years ago produced kids with higher earnings as adults, right? So that's in part a technical definition because of what you have available. But I think for sort of policy questions and understanding this, it would be really helpful to know what's different about high opportunity neighborhoods and low opportunity neighborhoods, particularly ones that are sort of, the rent is the same, but some seem to do better for kids than others. And pointing out also that the original MTO program incentivized families to move, or required them to move to low poverty neighborhoods, which is not necessarily the same thing as a high opportunity neighborhood. So I'm curious, from any of you, either based on these papers or your other research, when we talk about high opportunity neighborhoods, what's special about them?
All right, so I think that I can start on this. I think there's still a lot of work to obviously be done to understand what is the kind of secret sauce in a high opportunity area that is missing, quote unquote, or under invested in lower opportunity areas. And I don't think we know the answer to that. If you take all the observables we can find really in the census and try to just run a kind of a regression of trying to predict high versus low opportunity areas using things like the poverty rates, the best R squared you can really get out of that is like 50, 60%. And there's just an enormous amount of variation that we just don't really understand. And some of the strongest predictors are things like the fraction of two-parent households and the number of people that return their census forms. The types of things that we don't think is actually a causal, like that's not the secret sauce, that's something that's like what it smells like, right? And so we're trying to figure out, what exactly is it in these neighborhoods that drives those patterns. And so I think we don't know. And so then I think, the second thing here, and I think this comes back a little bit to the discussion of what are we trying to do with the policy? Are we trying to improve kids' outcomes? Are we trying to improve adult outcomes? In some cases, like in the mechanisms that Stephanie was alluding to, those could be very much aligned, that if you improve the mental health of parents, perhaps you're having spillover effects onto kids. But perhaps there are other trade-offs. If there are other types of experiments, say, if you're pairing with Jobs Plus type programs and you have to be close to employment, maybe those aren't the same neighborhoods where the types of infrastructures for children are the strongest. I don't know. I think there's a lot to be unpacked to really understand those. But I think the one thing we are learning is that neighborhoods are very multidimensional. One example I can give you concretely there is that the types of neighborhoods that are more likely to induce children to go to college are not always the same ones that induce the highest earnings. There's actually orthogonal variation in those neighborhoods. And actually, if your child moves to the neighborhoods that have the higher college-going rates at an earlier age, but no higher incomes, on average, are more likely to go to college and they don't have higher incomes. It's like we're sort of this product of the neighborhood environments we grew up in, this multidimensional type of environment that you're growing up that's shaping, to a large extent, your outcomes in adulthood. But what is doing it, I think, is the big open question.
I think the answer, we don't know enough yet, is something I would also say. But, to this point, I mean, we're going to be following families in Seattle to ask them what has changed, about the way that life looks for you now. Right, you starting broad like that and then waiting to hear how much of that has to do with the way parents interact with their communities and their children. But what I've always seen across many families in the cities that I've been in is the sort of adaptive strategic efforts parents put forward to take the advantages that they can from different kinds of neighborhoods and places where, one neighborhood may provide work, another may be where childcare resides with an auntie, and then, there's the neighborhood where you and your children sleep at night. And so I think there's, to Nathan's point, quite a bit of patchwork parenting and strategy going on that does complicate some of these simple answers. But sure, it certainly shouldn't be meant to emphasize how much work parents are doing actually to try and put all these benefits together.
And just one thing that I think is well established at this point is that violence undermines communities in a way that I think is impossible to ignore and is present in every ethnography of urban poverty and disadvantage, and it does so by undermining investment, both investment of families, whether families are willing to buy a house to raise children in a community, business owners, whether they're willing to set up shop, members of core community institutions like schools, whether teachers are willing to invest in a school district, whether people are willing to venture out into public space and take advantage of libraries and other amenities and be out in public space. And so that comes out of ethnography, and that's also, I think, been strongly supported in quantitative work as well. So I don't want to leave the impression that we know nothing about what creates strong, thriving communities. One thing we do know is that is impossible if public spaces are unsafe. Now, there's a lot more that has to go on to develop the kind of core institutions that can make sure that every kid has a place to go, that families have support networks and so forth. But I think that is the starting point. It's very hard for places to thrive if public spaces are unsafe.
So I just want to echo the importance of safety, and Jens talked about this a bit at the end of his presentation. It really was one of the things that was the most striking to us early on. So like the paper that he was alluding to one of the first papers we wrote, which is now like over 20 years ago, was called Bullets Don't Got No Name. And so this paper was really about the stories of families that we sat down with. And this woman's story was about how she really kept her kids inside because she didn't really know when that bullet was going to find her kid. But those bullets were out there, and they might get her kid at any time. And so those kinds of things were sort of the anecdotes that were underlying the very broad measures of safety that we were capturing in the surveys, and we think are very important parts of the mental health effects that we saw were important causal effects of moving to higher opportunity areas. So that's a way in which we think of that story as all fitting together.
So we can use tools like the Opportunity Atlas to help identify neighborhoods that at least historically have been high opportunity. Once we find these neighborhoods, presumably we'd like to help as many people as possible have the opportunity to move there if they want to. And the CMTO research is starting to show us that we can think of sort of barriers to moving into these high opportunity neighborhoods, both at the family level, so things like they have poor credit, they're having a hard time finding a landlord to rent to them, they've have difficult personal circumstances or financial circumstances, so kind of family specific, but they're also sort of broader neighborhood or market or institutional barriers. And we can actually think about something like, the landlord's unwillingness to rent to a Section 8 voucher holder as an institutional barrier. So as we think about kind of policy solutions, could we think about the kinds of interventions that we would do at the family level and the kinds of policies that might be effective at a broader level, at a neighborhood or market or a sort of a housing market level that would be helpful? Take either one of those or both.
So I'm going to take the landlord piece on this because we, while we've been talking to families for the last while, we've also been talking to landlords in Baltimore, Cleveland, Dallas, DC, and we'll be talking to landlords in Seattle as well. And there's some really interesting things that you find, for effective policies have in common when, helping families move and helping convince landlords to take voucher holders. And I think treating people with respect and dignity is a key piece of that. So that's one of the things we talk about in the paper about CMTO is just families feel a lot of support and they feel like their choices and their vision for their future matters. And that's part of what's so compelling about the navigators. Landlords also want to be treated well. And so we talked to nearly 160 landlords in Baltimore, Dallas, and Cleveland, and we asked them, this is work supported by HUD and the Annie E. Casey Foundation in partnership, we asked landlords why they didn't take voucher holders. The interesting thing was that nearly 2/3 of the landlords we had spoken to previously had rented to voucher holders, which means that maybe they'd do it again, right? Why weren't they renting to voucher holders? And there's been work, at the Urban Institute on this as well, on the pervasiveness of landlord discrimination. But things came up like not having someone to talk to at the housing authority, not having someone to answer the phone when you have a question about paperwork or bureaucracy. The bureaucracy itself, if you've never failed an inspection, why are you having to go through one every single year? Why the inspections seem capricious, unfair, and unpredictable. And this just drives landlords crazy. Will it be the fact that the screen door has a crack, but the storm door itself is perfectly sturdy and the inspection fails? They hate this, right? And one thing we learned from the Baltimore mobility program, and there are folks here, Pete and Adria, who are running this. I think Allison is somewhere in the on the phone, who previously worked in Baltimore, found very similar things. And so staff were dedicated, like they are in Seattle, to helping build relationships with landlords to understand what they need, how to get it, and then also to be able to bridge the divide between what landlords think about voucher holders if they've never rented to them and who voucher holders really are by having families create rental resumes to help explain who they are and why there might be that mark on their credit history. Providing landlords with damage guarantee funds that hardly ever get used by saying, look, we get that you're a business person and we respect that. So if something happens, we understand, we got that, we can cover you if you're willing to rent to a family. These are really compelling things to say to landlords, and over 4,000 households have moved in the Baltimore region to opportunity neighborhoods, right? And so it's possible to do this by building relationships with landlords. And I think that can benefits not just families who are moving with mobility programs, but families in general in our rental market. We don't do enough to support the folks who own the properties that house our poorest families, and we are increasingly relying on the private market to do this job. So we really need to understand better how to do it. And this, I think, may come as a surprise to many in the room who may see landlords as money-grubbing, profit-making jerks. Which is a narrative out there. It's the exception in our field work. Landlords are people too. And many can't believe how they've ended up ever having to ask someone to leave a property. So I don't pretend to paint a picture of all of them as being kind-hearted and altruistic, but you'd be surprised how many are. But more importantly, how many are reasonable business folks who are wanting to work with a program that understands that.
So we're here to talk about this program, Moving to Opportunity, which was designed by Marge Turner and others because of a problem of concentrated poverty. So I do think in addition to thinking about this policy intervention and related interventions, we should at least say out loud the broader historical context, which all of you know, but it's worth just acknowledging it. So over the past 50 years and much longer, of course, our primary response, so instead of investing to deal with core social challenges like concentrated poverty and joblessness and violence and segregation and racial conflict and social unrest and and climate change, the things that started to become most visible in cities really in the 60s and 70s, we have instead taken an approach where we have allowed and in fact subsidized advantaged segments of the population to remove themselves, to separate themselves from those social problems, to establish barriers, barricades, sometimes physical barricades in space. And by this, I mean, I'm talking about land use regulations, I'm talking about gated communities, but I'm also talking about forming new governments, exclusive school districts. I'm talking about the whole array of mechanisms that have been used to allow segments of the population to distance themselves from those social problems, okay? And this has been subsidized for the past 50 years by social policy. This has been our response to those problems, the establishment of these barricades. And so these policies are designed to quarantine problems in particular areas, to isolate advantaged segments from those areas, and to restrict access. Who can access these areas of opportunity? So while we're talking about programs that can be thought of as ways to scale those barricades, to allow small numbers of people to move beyond, to jump over those barricades that divide every inch of American soil, we also have to think not just about improving the places behind the barricades, but about tearing those barricades down. And that gets us into discussions about land use policy. That gets us into discussions, Jenny is an expert in housing, and all of my ideas about housing come from you, so, it would be good if you could chime in on what are some of those ideas. But transit investment, making sure that every jurisdiction is forced to build affordable housing, even if they have no desire to do so, ending the home mortgage interest deduction. These are policy domains that I think everybody in the room knows are essential, but we don't want to limit our focus. So it's fantastic to help people access areas of opportunity, and that's really valuable. And the Seattle project is incredibly promising and encouraging, and I love it. But we also always have to keep this broader discussion about how do we tear down those barricades while we have this discussion about allowing larger numbers to overcome them, to scale them.
I'm so excited you brought up zoning. That wasn't a plant, but it's timely. So let's talk about one of the ways to create more available neighborhoods is just to make sure that there are rental apartments within whatever HUD's willingness to pay the rent available in lots of these areas. And I'd be curious to know from the work that you guys did with individual families, with landlords, doing outreach, how hard was it to find apartments within the FMR standard for people to apply to? Were there neighborhoods that you would have loved people to be able to go move to and there was just nothing there?
I mean, that's a pretty good question, and I think actually we could almost defer it to the next panel and have Sarah answer that one. I'm staring at her right now, who's in Seattle. Yeah, right. I'll punt the good ones down the line. I think, are there particular places that were sort of excluded? I think there's a lot of, there's generally a shortage of housing in Seattle as far as that's basically the uniform response when we talk with people there. It's like, my goodness, this housing market is so tough, and you hear that in so many cities. And I think that then speaks to the policies of, and the questions of, should we be allowing localities to be making those decisions when the impacts are on all of us and on the national scale? I think that's the fundamental tension we face when opportunity for kids is inherently local, is inherently about neighborhoods, is inherently likely driven by decisions that are happening inside of neighborhoods. And those implications are implications for children who grow up and live throughout the country, pay tax revenue or don't pay as much tax revenue. I think these kinds of effects really affect us all, but they're decisions that are occurring at the local level. That's sort of a classic case for sort of an externality where you get exactly the kind of barriers that Pat's talking about to arise, and I think that is a big issue that is sort of coming to its forefront. Specific recommendations on what we should do about it, I think that's a tougher set of things, because presumably there's benefits to allowing local decision makers to make good decisions in their communities and to have stakes in their communities. But these are the kinds of trade-offs we have to work through.
So I want us to think a little bit about the extent to which this program could be scaled. And let's pretend for the moment that resources aren't a constraint. So assume that, or financial resources aren't a constraint, right? So finances aren't the only problem that we'd run into. So one question is, are there going to be apartments available in all of the communities you want and enough apartments to absorb more people? I think another question is, what would this program look like if you scaled it up? There were, 300 families who are part of this. The Seattle Housing Authority administers, tens of thousands of vouchers. Would it be possible for Seattle and King County to provide the same sort of family-level counseling and services and assistance matching to apartments to everybody who has a voucher? Is that something that's feasible to scale? Is that something that's just not going to work if you open it up to the whole housing authority?
So, I think it's one of the questions, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't all be here thinking about how this could possibly be done where we live. I think, what does scaling mean, right? Does that mean we're going to offer enough, assistance for all voucher holders to move, right? There are lots of reasons to think that might not be the best strategy. But if, finances aren't an issue, I think we want to focus on creating a good program. I think that that one of the things that works so well in Seattle is you have high functioning housing authorities who have high functioning partners who really built a terrific program that's working really well for families who struggle as much as any family I've met in Baltimore or Cleveland or anywhere else. So, I think if we talk about scaling and we immediately think, are there enough units? I think, can we make good programs? And different cities and localities are going to have challenges with that because, some of the staff at housing agencies I've talked to in different cities say, well, we're trying to do the voucher program already just by itself, and that's hard. Or we're trying to figure out how to manage some of the properties we have. That's hard enough. So I think we want to, figure out institutional capacity, and then we want to figure out how to design really high quality programs. I mean, that's the first thing, and then, or at least a parallel thing to consider in the idea of scaling up. I mean, but again, I'll turn to the Baltimore program. That I've been talking to families from that program for a long time, and nearly 4,000 households have moved across the central Maryland area over 16 years. I think if I've got some of those numbers about right. Pete, I don't know, you probably have symbolic, the more updated numbers, which is extraordinary. And possible. It happened. People found a way to do it. Landlords said yes. So I think there are lots of things that are possible and reasons to be optimistic, but we want to say, do we want that to be the policy, right? To some of Pat's points and also to your expertise, Jenny. But also, let's figure out how to develop good programs where we decide to scale. I don't think I can emphasize that enough.
With respect to the scale, I think it's pretty clear that one could have a national program that was in hundreds of cities rather than 5 demonstration cities, and had a budget that was billions of dollars as opposed to a demonstration that's on the order of 70 million. That still is a long way from completely unconstrained budgetary resources and serving every person who was possibly eligible, but that is much bigger than the demonstrations that have occurred, and so like orders of magnitude bigger. So there's a lot of room to scale that I think pretty clearly could be scaled, and then there's also some limits beyond that.
Like this may be asking you guys to get outside of sort of your comfort zone, your expertise, but both MTO and CMTO were done in select cities. So Seattle, Baltimore, so there are a handful of cities. If HUD were thinking about replicating this in other cities, are there lessons for the kinds of cities where this would be easier to replicate or be more likely to succeed, either in terms of the housing authority, the housing market, the neighborhood characteristics? I mean, one of the distinct features of Seattle is the demographics there look really different than in a lot of other cities, right? West Coast cities, Midwest, Northeast cities look pretty different. Does that have implications for where we could do something like this and have it work?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I mean, I think it is coming outside of our comfort zone, but I'll try to step out there. I think, one of the key features, I think, of the experiment in Seattle, for example, and I think was a feature of MTO as well, so the key feature in Seattle is the main program was very tailored to each individual. And so when we talk about high quality, it's like each family sort of got what they needed out of the program. And that requires, I think, a degree of motivation by the parties involved in the program to execute that. And so I think there is an important design question for how do we ensure that type of quality throughout an expansion. And I think that's always the case with many expansions of government services. And I think that's an important question whenever we think about a scale. I think in the MTO, if I recall, there was some site heterogeneity in the extent to which the experiment itself was implemented, and then also in the outcomes as well, which I think unfortunately, because it only got to 5 sites and it didn't have the second round that was originally planned, we don't know what the general characteristics are of places that succeed at this versus don't. And I think that is really important to understand. You want to be able to trace out that scaling path and understand, who should be doing this, who shouldn't be doing this, and if they can't do it, what needs to change in order for them to do it. I think, unfortunately, we're not there now, but I do think we're excited with the number of partners that have been excited about doing this type of work, like what we've been doing up in Seattle, and are hopeful that we can try to generate that library over time. But it is very important, and it's not something we know now.
Do you want to say just quickly sort of where other cities are where you guys are working or planning to work?
Yeah, so we have partners that are in Chicago. There's folks that MDRC has been working with there in Chicago and working with us in St. Louis. Milwaukee has been in discussions. New York has been in discussions with this. I think there's a broad sort of coalition of folks, broadly MTW agencies that have a lot more flexibility in what they're able to do, that have sort of been at the table and said, hey, we'd be very interested in trying to do things along these lines. I think the extent to which, what each site is actually going to be engaged in, I think is an ongoing set of discussions. So I don't want to put any particular housing authority out on the spot of like, oh, they're going to do this and they're going to do that. But I think there is enormous excitement that is out there in the housing authority space that we're excited to build on.
So I want to come back to a point that Jens made in his presentation, which is that even if we could manage to scale up the treatment for voucher holders, or maybe even for all housing authority clients, there are going to be a lot of people who aren't going to get this treatment, right? I mean, even in your program with very intensive kind of counseling, was it 45% of the treatment families stayed in, what you're defining as not high opportunity neighborhoods. In MTO, the percentage was even higher, right? So a lot of families are not going to move to the areas that are on the Opportunity Atlas map. What should we be doing to make neighborhoods better for people who are staying? I'm expecting you to solve all neighborhood problems in the next 20 minutes.
So I'm going to take the second part of the question, actually, and just maybe clarify a few things that get misunderstood. So with the original MTO take-up rates hovering at 50% or lower in some cities, it's a number of critics have interpreted that as saying, families, those were families who chose not to move, who didn't want to move. And I think it's easy when you see, low policy take-up rates or apparent policy failure to look for individual explanations and overstate the durability of preferences for low-income or low-opportunity neighborhoods. We talked to lots of families in the Baltimore site of MTO to try to understand a bit more why it is that the take-up rate was low and why it seemed that so many families moved back to higher poverty neighborhoods. And I think, the first thing I'll say is that the MTO families didn't receive a fraction of the support that the CMTO families received, and were having to use a voucher that was extraordinarily limited. The policy itself is quite limited. There was no source of income no source of income protection against discrimination by landlords in any of the sites. And you had, as far as I know, payment standards weren't high enough. There was no help with security deposits. It's difficult to use vouchers across jurisdictions. Families had to apply to multiple housing authorities. So I could go on. But so one thing to clarify, just whenever those take-up rates come up, is that it's difficult to use the voucher with some modest counseling. I think families who did move, when we spoke with them, many talked about how they enjoyed the safety that Pat and Jeff and Jens have talked about, and didn't want to move out of safer neighborhoods, but because landlords sold properties, they had to, and they had no help. And then, a limited voucher. There are housing quality failures, and so there were quick moves that had to happen. Families changed size, they had to move, and again, there was no support, and families were forced to move in a rental market that was far less hospitable to voucher holders than it is even today. And so I think that it's important to talk about that take-up rate as being not evidence so much of families not wanting to move, and therefore that's a reason to think about how many that wouldn't be served. So that's an important clarification. I think in Seattle, the take-up rate's interesting. We're looking still, at least in the qualitative data, and I'm sure that some of the program data still to understand that. But what we heard from families that we talked to, was a number of immigrant families who understood perfectly well the benefits that the navigators explained to them about moving to opportunity neighborhoods, but had deep community ties that involved work. Some were home healthcare workers. Some had very limited English skills and were relying on friends to help broker leases with landlords as it was. And then, also there were some families who had just leased up somewhere and didn't want to even think about breaking that lease and moving. So anyway, the take-up rates are complex. And so I wanted to just put that out there by way of just talking a little bit about that.
Another thing I'll say is that I think one of the goals of the work that we've been doing is to try to learn some about what Nathan referred to as the secret sauce. And to the extent that you think part of the secret sauce is safety, then you can either move to it or try to create it. And so there are a lot of tools to try to create it, whether it's policing policy or after-school programs or some of the catalog that Jens mentioned. That's a way in which you can think of what this research is telling us about place to give you a direction for where to focus one's energy to try to create some of those conditions.
I want to make sure you get a chance to chime in. So crime is one of your specialty areas. One thing we know that's different about cities and neighborhoods is that crime was much higher all across the U.S. in the 1990s when MTO was launched than it is today. Does that make a difference for how we should expect kids to grow up in neighborhoods today? I mean, even the kids who don't get a chance to move, do we expect there to be sort of a substantial improvement in everybody's outcomes?
Absolutely, I expect that. I mean, the problem of concentrated poverty looked entirely different in the early 1990s than it does now, because in most major cities, violent crime has plummeted. And so concentrated poverty means something very different now, not everywhere, but in New York, LA, San Diego, DC, not as much in Baltimore, which still has the same level of violence that it had 25 years ago. So this leads to the question then, should we see, if violence is as important as I've argued it is, and other people have suggested it is as well, then should we see these major changes in what it means to grow up in disadvantaged neighborhoods? And in fact, when you look at the data, we have seen those changes. So in the places where violence has fallen the most, academic achievement has improved the most. There's very strong evidence for long-term gains in economic mobility. You have the basic outcome of life expectancy. So life expectancy has improved dramatically for segments of the population that were hit hardest by violent crime and continue to be hit hardest by violent crime, most notably black men. Okay, life expectancy of black men is still way lower than white men and white and black women, and there's a huge gap that remains, but it has shot up the most. Okay, and you can, in a mechanical way, you can look at how the decline of violence has affected life expectancy, and I find in my work that this has probably been the most important public health advancement of the past several decades. So, for black men in particular. So I think the expectation is that the drop in violence should change the meaning of concentrated poverty, and in fact it has. It doesn't mean it has made concentrated poverty unimportant. We have new challenges. The housing crisis has worsened in the past 25 years. Economic inequality has worsened in the past 25 years. We have a whole host of new challenges that are present in cities, and poverty is not any easier than it was 25 years ago, but it looks very different.
So I'm going to give the panelists one last round of questions and then open it up to you guys so you can start thinking about your questions. So for each of you, we've learned a lot from both of these programs, from these demonstrations, from going back and reanalyzing the data. If you could pick one or two sort of top knowledge gaps, questions we don't yet know the answer to that you think are really important, particularly for making decisions about policy, about where to invest our resources, what don't we know that we need to find out moving forward?
So I think the secret sauce, I guess I'll come back to here. I mean, I think we do know that certain things do matter. So there is good evidence that increased spending on schools, for example, and crime do have a causal role in promoting upward mobility. But I think we don't have a sense of what drives the dramatic variation across the United States in mobility that we do see.
One of the hardest things to study, which is I think why we perhaps know the least about it, is what is the effect on a receiving neighborhood when new families move into it. So they're such a small part of such a big thing, it's really hard to tease out. And it could be that the controlling factor is really the plurality and they have very little influence on it, or it could be that the effects are very nonlinear, and they could have a very big effect, and we really have not had a good way of sorting that out. But that's one of the things that's I would identify.
Which matters a lot for the scaling question. If we're going to send many more people to some of the receiving neighborhoods, what does that do to the receiving neighborhood?
Okay, so I think there's still a lot of work to be done on understanding exactly what generates that variation that Nathan pointed to on the map of Seattle or any city where there's this huge variation within cities in upward mobility in places that don't look, at least at the surface level, all that different. So I think that's generative of our research agenda to figure out exactly what's going in, and we have some hints, we have some starting points, but I think that's a next phase, and thankfully Nathan and Raj Chetty and the team at Opportunity Insights make this data public, so we can get to work and try to figure it out. So that's one key item on a research agenda. I think a second one, we kind of dodged Jenny's question a little bit on what investments in communities are crucial to making sure that communities don't fall apart, that neighborhoods don't go downhill. And again, we have some hints and some ideas there, but I think that's a more general question. I argue that we really need to think beyond an individual safety net and really think about community safety nets and how to make sure that every neighborhood has a set of institutions and organizations and public spaces that allow it to avoid going downhill when the next crisis hits, whatever that next crisis might be. And I think we don't have a precise set of ideas about what those investments might be. Okay, third, the political challenge is the huge one. When we start to think about how to tear down invisible barricades, how to deal with land use regulations, how to make sure communities build affordable housing, I think that we need guidance from the people who are trying to do this and have run into political obstacles to doing this. And so this involves legal scholars, this involves practitioners to figure out how to do this effectively.
I think it's not surprising we have some gaps in common, given that we're all interested in some of the same questions. The place-based question is something I've been thinking about for a long time. Quite some time ago, Alex Polikoff called me and said, how's Sandtown Winchester doing? And I was in the car, and he said, I think maybe you should take a look. And I said, well, Alex, I've got a bunch of other stuff going on, but why don't I just take some of the census data and take a look and, a bird's eye view of Sandtown, Winchester, and West Baltimore and compare it to other similarly situated neighborhoods in Baltimore in the 1990s when Sandtown got, by our calculation, lowball estimate, $130 million in an 8x9 block neighborhood to deal with housing, some education, workforce training. There's a lot we don't know about the investments made in Sandtown. And so, it was a dark day to have to release the report through the Able Foundation to say that at least, the way we compared neighborhoods in Baltimore who hadn't gotten that money, Sandtown didn't look all that much better. Home ownership increased quite a bit between 1990 and 2010, but so did foreclosure right after that, which got me thinking about how vulnerable neighborhoods like Sandtown, Winchester are. When we think about place-based, is it that we invest in the neighborhoods that need it most, which was the motivation by Jim Rouse and others to invest in Sandtown. But during this period, the labor market in Baltimore became no more favorable to people without a college degree. The aggressive policing tactics in Baltimore were at a peak. And all the neighborhoods around Sandtown were high poverty as well. So it was tricky. I haven't stopped thinking about it. We're looking at development strategies in 16 neighborhoods in Baltimore right now, different kinds of partnerships, public and private, to see whether it's possible for communities to have amenities. folks who've been waiting 25 years, like those in Berkeley. So that's, work in progress. I'm not able to know for sure what we'll see, but it's difficult work, and we need to do more of it. The measurement issues are difficult. We tend to really follow money that gives individuals benefits. We follow that money really carefully, but we don't always follow money that's invested in communities the same way with research. And we definitely need to do that. So I think, part of my agenda and one that I would encourage is increasingly trying to understand the payoff to place-based strategies. I know Laura Tack and Pat and you guys, and I think Nathan and Raj are also working on trying to pinpoint the payoff to those kinds of investments so we can learn a bit more using some of the tax data. So I think it's a big research agenda item. I love Baltimore, even though it's a tough place to live right now, and I think we can't just shrink it. We can't just solve our problems by shrinking cities. So how do we do something better? The other thing I've been thinking a lot about is just how this is, a really basic urban social question. How do people measure and interact with their neighborhoods? And doing work in Seattle was really influential in rethinking this on my part, because living in Baltimore and being on a block face, and you walk out of the street and there's lots of folks, running around, and you interact with neighbors. A lot of the affordable developments in Seattle, your neighbors are part of that complex. We saw some of this in Dallas as well. So how, folks define neighborhoods and then how they interact with it is something, to the secret sauce a bit, is something we want to, I think, go back to basics a little bit and try to think about that. And I'm also thinking, about some of your earlier work, Pat, on street efficacy and how young people engage with neighborhoods and how we select what we want to avoid and what we want to go toward. And so these are sort of two offerings of things that I've been thinking a lot about that we should, number one, we should do a better job, and number two, we should maybe revisit and do that research agenda again.
Great. All right. So if you're interested in asking a question, raise your hand. We have some staff circulating with microphones. Make sure you speak into the microphone. If you can, identify who you are, who you're with. And as David Elwood used to say, please ask your question in the form of a question that ends in a question mark. Yeah.
Hi, Sam Dastrup from Apt Associates. I had a clarification on the Seattle work, on the timing, and specifically relative to the implementation of the zip code payment standard, the small area fair market rents. And more broadly, just wondered how important you thought that, if I'm right and it was post small FMRs, how important that is to have that higher rents and the higher zip, you showed some correlation. And so the question mark is, how important are the rents to the whole question?
Yeah, good question. So what he's referring to is that there's 5-tiered payment standards in the King County area, and an additional bonus payment in the Seattle area for moving to an opportunity area that generally has higher rents. I think broadly what we see is that there's movement within each of the different tiers. So one of the things we see in King County is that they do move to more expensive neighborhoods, and that actually ends up increasing the kind of the net cost of the program. I think it's an open question on whether or not we would have seen as impactful moves. Like, did that enable a lot more families to move to opportunity because it opened up some of the neighborhoods near Bellevue and things like that were a little bit more expensive and kind of more traditionally thought of as good, quote unquote, good neighborhoods. And I think we don't know the answer of what the experiment would have looked like if they didn't have the tiered payment standards. Our sense, though, is that given the kind of uniformity in the distribution of moves within the opportunity areas, that there were a lot of places that were not actually the most expensive neighborhoods that a lot of families did choose to move to. So if you just simply threw those families sort of out of the data, the ones that went to the most expensive areas, you still would be seeing a significant effect given the strong effects that we're actually seeing. So I think we would have still seen an effect. How big it would have been, I think, is a harder question.
Mark?
Mark Schroeder, HUD. So I guess my question's for Nathan. And my question is this. When you showed your map of where the opportunity neighborhoods are in Seattle, or the Seattle area, most of them were in the suburbs. There was a few of them in North Seattle, which happens to be where the University of Washington is located. So my question is, if you used a poverty line, but it was somewhat liberalized for the fact that the cost of living is much higher, even for poor people in Seattle, than it is in the rest of the country, would your neighborhoods not be essentially the same as the ones you have?
Yeah, it would be similar, so it was certainly correlated with the poverty rate, but that actually wasn't one of the stronger correlates. It's actually more strongly correlated, that map, with other variables like the fraction of two-parent households in the tract. But to answer the question more directly, it would basically be like I think the correlation's right around 50%. So loosely, it's kind of you've picked up about half of that variation with the poverty rates, and you get an additional kicker with the others, with using the Opportunity Atlas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, let's go to the second row, third row here. Yeah.
Hi, Deborah Ray again from the University of Maryland. I just want to go back to my question regarding early learning centers. I'd like to know what kind of data you are collecting at the classroom level, where there might be more segregation that isn't identified at the school or the district level.
So I was thinking about your question, and I meant to address it. I can't answer that particular question, but I can say one thing, which is the daycare center question comes into play when the navigators meet with families. So we haven't actively collected data on that yet, and I think there's a lot of questions to still ask about what families, how they're benefiting. Which family routines have changed and improved or gotten harder, and all of that. But so one of the things that happens when families meet with the navigator is that they'll talk about what families need. What's your vision for what you'd like your life to be like? Where might you like to see yourself and your family living? Okay, let's talk about the different things that your kids need. Let's talk about daycare. Let's talk about after-school activities. Let's talk about swimming pools. How about you, Mom? Do you want to go back to school? Look, North Seattle Community College is not far. So those pieces come in, at least on the front end, as part of the package of families meeting with the navigators. So that's as much as, I was thinking about your question, I could come up with that where they feed in, but whether or not families then experience struggles because those daycare centers are different or not, we don't know yet.
On the aisle here. Yeah, the gentleman in the blue shirt.
My name is Mike Olash. I just want to ask, while you move people to an opportunity, more opportunity, or what actually happens in the community that they've left from? Does the quality of life deteriorate there, or does it stay the same, or does it probably doesn't get better? But
I think this was the open question that Jeff was proposing. I think we don't know the answer to that. I think one thing I'll say, in the Seattle context, a lot of the families are not actually even coming from neighborhoods within, say, Seattle and kind of moving out to the suburbs. That's not exactly the model you want to necessarily have in your mind in this particular context, but I think the general spirit of the question is one that needs to be answered, and I don't think we have a solid sense from an academic standpoint.
If your question is about the neighborhoods that people were coming from, then that has to do a lot with the wait list for people who are trying to get into those units. So the public housing that a lot of the voucher holders are coming from itself has a long wait list, and when somebody leaves, then they tend to be replaced with somebody who was like them, and so it doesn't change the characteristics of the place that they're coming from in a material way because of the queuing to get into that area and to begin with.
Richard.
I've been trying to stop myself asking this question, and I failed. I'm not quite satisfied with the polite consensus that we seem to have arrived at in the balance between moving people out of areas and then what we do for the people left behind. The consensus seems to be, we say, yes, we should move people out, But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do lots of things for the people left behind. And we're all kind of, that's how we get out of these conversations. But I'd like to ask, how would we know what was the right number of people then to move out? I think Pat just said we would want to move everybody out, obviously. And everyone says that. You don't know, okay. But it's been implied that we could move more people out than we do now. How would we know what was the optimum number to move out? Is it just a budgetary constraint, in which case the more the better? Is it however many people want to move out? Is it according to some algorithm for what would be the equitable thing to do? I just don't know. And my fear is that absent that conversation, this work, although it's not the intent, could be used almost as an argument against doing the things for the places left behind. It becomes a sort of social policy of escape committee. Look what happens, look at these great things that happen to the people that move out. And so without that being the intent, it might actually play into a narrative which doesn't pay enough attention to the people left behind. So I just want to try and interrupt that politeness that I'm feeling a little bit right now. Like, just tell me what you really think.
I'm Betsy Julian from Dallas. And actually, I will be polite. But that position, as twilight as I can, that argument has been going on for a very, very long time. I think it's a good point. The answer is, how many people do we let move out? That really articulates it in a way that I think speaks to the problem historically. Well, that's a really different, and you posited it differently, because when you don't want to really talk about letting people who've been contained by government policy be released from those constraints, then you talk about moving them out. Well, let's just stop for that. We would literally let every family who got the full Navigator resources. I think one of the reasons Seattle's so important is the families were told what their options were, and what we're seeing is what they wanted to do writ large. So I think if we start with nobody's moving anybody, they're saying you who have been contained can go. Can try to access opportunities. If you've got a 6-year-old child, you do not have to wait till we figure out the big answer to the question, what do you do about the place that is, quote, left behind? And I do think it's important to realize for voucher holders, many of these folks haven't been living in the communities they're living in. That's not their community. They live where they were able to find housing. It may not have been for more than a year. We have worked with over 4,000, 5,000 families over the past years in our program. It's not a research program, but the common themes are so real. People say that tell us where we can go, where can we find housing. All the problems that Stephanie identifies are the real ones for the families. But given the chance, and I think the Seattle program has so much power because it said with the kind of help, which is not rocket science. Given that kind of help, those are the kind of choices people get to make. So the answer is, how many you let people go who want to go. That's, in fact, I would argue that the most important thing you can do for a community that is struggling with concentrated poverty and with the legacy of segregation is to start with letting people go who don't want to be there, because I don't think you fight the kind of battle that is involved in the most distressed communities with hostages. My experience has been working in those communities and working with families who want to get out and people who want to stay, is that what you really want is a core of really committed volunteers, oftentimes homeowners who have lived in that community forever, or people who have those ties. That is your social capital that you want to cash in on as you try to address those issues. So I really want to push back on the notion that anybody talks about these programs moving people out as if we pick them up and put them someplace, and if you're going to tell them they can't go because we decided socially it would be bad for the communities in which we have put them in the first place. I think that is a fundamental bad way to look at this, the idea of this issue of whether it's a moving to advantage to communities, opportunity communities, or wherever people want to go, and where, if you will look on honestly, where poor white people have always been able to access much more than poor people of color. But I did want to, before you asked the question, I wanted to ask Patrick a question.
Yeah, let me give the panel a quick chance to respond to see if anybody has a different answer.
I mean, so I thought that the perspective that you have in terms of how to think about both what we did in Seattle and the implications for policy, I think were incredibly well said. I think The only sort of thing I could say on the place-based front, I think from a research standpoint, we don't have the analogous MTO, as Stephanie was alluding to. We don't know what a thing we can kind of latch onto that is going to necessarily improve places. We do know that there's it's good to invest in schools, and we know it's good to do policies that reduce crime. I think there's a lot of other spaces and examples of place-based policies that are hard to really sort of put your finger on, oh, this worked or this didn't work. And I think, highlighting the potential for needing to explore place-based policies as well is not because I necessarily think they are going to be better or worse than quote-unquote choice-based policies. I think, as you rightly said, I think we should all have choice. We should all have the freedom to live where we would like to live and raise our children. And I think in a lot of ways this is a civil rights issue. But I think at the end of the day, we also do want to have the body of research that we currently don't have for understanding what the impact of place-based policies are.
Can I ask Patrick the question I would have asked there's no secret sauce, and I absolutely think we've got to figure out what we do about the communities that these families are choosing to want to either escape from because there's still families there. Is it crime? And our families always say safety, like yours, that is driving a lot of what they want. If you had to say what is the most important policy that would raise the floor, let's put aside this whole idea of getting to opportunity. Let's talk about getting kids at 6 years old or younger out of the most low opportunity in the world, the most disadvantaged places. Do we have a metric that says we're going to at least get kids out of this? While we work on building and improving the neighborhoods that are high poverty or considered disadvantaged in general, is there a silver bullet? I don't want to use that term, but is there a metric like crime? And Patrick, I think if we could just get the crime down to a metro-wide average in a neighborhood that is otherwise high poverty and has a lot of the other problems, do you think that would is that an important policy metric that to say we're going to get kids out of this if it's below this?
So I think it's the first order, it's the fundamental challenge. I think it's necessary. It's not sufficient in the sense that nothing else can happen when a place is violent. The types of people and organizations that are potentially going to invest in a community won't do it if a place is violent. And I don't mean just residents. I also mean business owners and other. So I do think it's the first order challenge, but certainly not sufficient. And when we talk about, I use Marge's term place-conscious policies as opposed to place-based investments, because I do think there's a growing body of evidence, much of which comes from the crime lab in Chicago that Jens runs, but elsewhere, this result of greening abandoned lots in Philadelphia, more and more well-designed studies looking at not just Harlem Children's Zone, but similar organizations that take the perspective of looking out over a community. We have a growing body of evidence that suggests that if we invest in these kinds of organizations, or if a community sits on a foundation of strong organizations, then it's much less likely that that community is going to fall apart and go downhill. So beyond just saying, every community needs to become safe, I do think if I were going to call for a general policy that could apply to every single neighborhood across the country, I would say invest in strong organizations and institutions in that community. And if every community sits on that foundation of strong organizations, I think there's much lower likelihood that people are going to fall through the cracks, that the neighborhood is going to fall apart.
And that's an excellent place to turn it over to our practitioner panel. So thank you to our panelists for being here today. And
thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.